I was driving back from a late-night client visit in rural Arizona, wrapping up my last scheduled call out for the shift at my new 24/7 remote tech support gig. It was 2:45 a.m., and I was using my GPS to navigate the highways back to home. I realized that I was running low on gas, so I searched for the nearest gas station in the Google Maps app and set it as my next stop. It was just a short drive away. About 7 minutes later, I pulled into Love's truck stop, the only gas station for miles. As I headed toward the store, behind where I'd parked the car, I noticed a man getting out of a dark-colored truck a few pumps away, watching me briefly before turning away when I looked his way. I shrugged it off and continued inside to pay for my gas. When I was reaching the queue for the register, that same man entered the store and cut right in front of me in line. He didn't even glance back or acknowledge my presence. I felt a brief flash of irritation, but I wasn't in the mood for confrontation, so I just let it slide. After paying for my gas, I decided to grab some coffee and use the restroom. A couple of minutes later, I returned to my car and began filling up the tank. As I stood there, I saw the man again, now standing by his truck. He was staring directly at me, but this time his eyes lingered longer. I glanced back, trying not to make it obvious that I noticed. Through the gaps between a couple of parked trucks, I caught a glimpse of him making some kind of gesture with his hand, but I couldn't fully see what it was. I hurried to finish the fill-up, got back into my car, and pulled out of the station. My nerves were on edge, and I was beat, and I just wanted to get home and into bed. A few minutes after leaving the gas station, I noticed a vehicle flashing their lights at me. Initially, I thought it might be a signal indicating a police presence in the area, but as I entered a less lit area out of town, I realized my own headlights weren't shining, which was strange, as they were working fine before. I checked the headlight switch, making sure it was in the on position, and sure enough it was. Perplexed, I pulled over to the side of the road. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out to investigate. That's when I discovered both my headlights were smashed. The thought crossed my mind that the man from the gas station might have intentionally damaged them, purely based on the way he had been acting. But I couldn't be sure. I retrieved my phone and started searching online for roadside assistance. Suddenly, I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. I expected to see headlights behind me, but it was just pitch black. The engine cut off, and it was suddenly quiet again. I turned around, shining my flashlight down the road behind me. In the distance, I could just make out the faint reflection of headlights at least 100 yards away, barely visible. I returned to my car and locked the door. I was going to call roadside assistance, but with the truck lingering, I decided to dial 911 instead. Just as I grabbed my phone to make the call, I glanced in the driver's side mirror and noticed a figure walking toward me from the direction of the truck. He was maybe halfway between the truck and my car. In the dim light, it looked like the guy from the gas station, but I couldn't be sure. The dispatcher answered, and I whispered into the phone, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. She asked for more information. As I was speaking to the dispatcher, the driver seemed to reconsider his plans and went back to his truck. I can only speculate as to why, that maybe he saw me on the phone and thought I was calling the police. Moments later, the truck's engine roared back to life, and the truck pulled alongside me. I had the phone pressed to my ear, my heart pounding as the driver rolled down his window. It was definitely him, the guy from the gas station. He stared at me, his eyes locked on mine, and it really freaked me out. Without saying a word, he slowly lifted a gun, waving it just enough for me to see. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear him. But I was almost certain he mouthed, "I'll hunt you down, nerd." Then, with his free hand, he made a slow, deliberate motion across his neck, mimicking the slice of a knife, just to drive his point home. The truck sped away, disappearing into the darkness. I explained to the dispatcher what just happened, and that the man had threatened me. She reassured me that help was almost there. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, and I explained everything to them about the smashed headlights, the man from the gas station, and the gun threat. They reassured me they'd check the gas station security footage and look into the truck. I contacted roadside assistance, and the police stayed with me until the tow truck arrived. Once everything was sorted, my mom picked me up, and I finally made it home, shaken but safe. A few days later, I heard back from the police. They were able to locate the truck from the gas station security footage, but it had been reported stolen earlier that night. The man had paid cash, and no one at the gas station recognized him. With no further leads or identification, the case seemed to go cold. I was driving home late one night, my newly purchased Ferrari California purring beneath me. I just bought it in Miami, a 2010 model. Second-hand, but still my dream car. I couldn't afford a brand new one, but this beauty was more than enough for me. The clock on the dash read 11:30 p.m. as I approached Fort Pierce, just about 15 miles south of my hometown of Vero Beach. The highway stretched empty before me, with only the occasional whoosh of a passing car breaking the silence. Fatigue was setting in after the long drive, my eyes heavy, but I was almost home. I couldn't wait to park this beauty in my garage. As I approached the outskirts of Fort Pierce, flashing blue lights suddenly appeared in my rearview mirror. My heart jumped. I hadn't been speeding, so I was unsure why I was being pulled over. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. Was there something off about the sale? But I quickly dismissed it. The seller had seemed legitimate, and the paperwork was all in order. I signaled and pulled to the side of the road, stopping my car. The lights stopped behind me, and I saw a silhouette step out of the vehicle. The man approached my window. I rolled it down, feeling uneasy. He wore what looked like a police uniform, but in the dim light, I couldn't make out the details clearly. His approach seemed oddly casual for an officer, but I figured it might just be a small-town thing. He demanded my license and registration, his voice gruff. I handed over my documents, my hand shaking slightly. He took them without a word, shining a flashlight in my face. The light was blinding, and I had to look away. I asked him what the problem was, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away, just kept looking at my license. Then he glanced at me, his eyes cold. He told me to step out of the car. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. Something wasn't right. I asked him why, my voice higher than intended. He repeated the command, more forcefully this time. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. Every instinct told me not to get out, but I didn't know what else to do. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped out. He moved closer, the flashlight now aimed at my chest. He ordered me to turn around and put my hands on the car. My heart was racing, and I asked what I did wrong. His voice snapped as he told me to just do it. I turned and placed my hands on the roof of the Ferrari, feeling vulnerable and exposed. I heard him moving behind me, the crunch of gravel under his boots. Suddenly, I felt a rough hand grab my wrist, yanking it behind my back. Panic surged through me. I asked what he was doing. He didn't answer, just pulled my other arm back, pinning me against the car. Fear took over, and I struggled, trying to break free. This wasn't right. I begged him to let me go, my voice shaking. He leaned in close, his breath hot on my neck, and told me to shut up. I felt something cold and hard against my wrist. Handcuffs. My heart pounded in my chest as he secured them tightly, the metal biting into my skin. He shoved me aside and got into my Ferrari. I watched helplessly as he started the car, the engine roaring to life. Panic surged through me as I realized this was a robbery. He sped away in my Ferrari, the taillights quickly disappearing into the darkness. I saw the police car begin to move as well. Another figure, an accomplice, was behind the wheel. They made a quick U-turn and sped off in the opposite direction, leaving me alone and handcuffed on the shoulder of the dark highway. Alone and confused, I knew I needed help. Despite the pain from the tight handcuffs, I managed to stumble towards the middle of the road. My heart raced as I saw headlights approaching in the distance. I stood my ground, unable to wave my hands. I just had to hope they would stop. The approaching car slowed, then came to a stop. An older man rolled down his window, his face a mix of concern and caution. I quickly explained my situation, my voice shaking. He hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure whether to trust me. But seeing my distress and the handcuffs, he decided to help. He stepped out of his car and used his cell phone to call 911. As we waited for the police to arrive, he stayed with me, offering words of comfort. I was grateful for his kindness, but couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, still handcuffed and stranded on the dark highway. Time seemed to crawl by. Every sound made me jump, fearing the thieves might return. I kept glancing down the dark highway, hoping to see real police lights. The handcuffs were tight, and my wrists were starting to ache. I tried to stay calm, focusing on the Good Samaritan's reassuring presence as we waited for help to arrive. After what felt like an eternity, I heard sirens in the distance. My heart leaped. Help was coming. But as the sound grew closer, a new fear gripped me. How could I be sure these were real police? I scrutinized the approaching vehicle, looking for any signs that they might be fake. Paranoia had truly set in. A police car pulled up, their lights illuminating the scene. A couple of officers stepped out, approaching me cautiously. I found myself hesitant to trust them, still shaken from the deception. I examined their uniforms and badges closely, looking for any inconsistencies. They asked me if I was okay and began to remove the handcuffs. I winced as the metal scraped against my sore wrists. Once free, I rubbed my wrists, relief washing over me. the officers asked me to recount what had happened. I described the thieves and my stolen Ferrari in detail, hoping it would help them catch them. As I spoke, I realized how easily I'd been tricked. Now, I couldn't help but question every interaction. The real officers noticed my unease and tried to reassure me, but their words did little to calm my nerves. They took my statement and offered to drive me home, but the thought of getting into a police car made my stomach churn. I asked if I could call a friend instead. They agreed, staying with me until my ride arrived. As I waited, I couldn't stop thinking about my stolen Ferrari. It wasn't just a car, it represented years of hard work and saving. The thought of it in the hands of those thieves made me feel violated. The officers promised they would do everything they could to recover it, but I knew the chances were slim. My friend arrived, looking worried. On the ride home, I struggled to explain what had happened to him. The events felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My friend listened patiently, offering words of comfort, but I could tell he was shocked by the story. As we pulled up to my house, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. I was home, safe, but the memory of the night's events lingered. I thanked my friend and walked to my front door. Inside, I methodically checked all the locks, then drew the curtains closed. I knew sleep would be impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the thief's cold stare, felt the bite of the handcuffs. I made a cup of tea with shaking hands and sat in my living room, waiting for the sun to rise, hoping daylight would somehow make things better. In the morning, I called the police station for an update. They hadn't found my car. As I hung up, a thought struck me. The seller. I hadn't suspected them initially, but now I wondered. I dug out the seller's number and dialed. A robotic voice informed me the number was disconnected. Strange. I checked my emails for any other contact information, but found nothing. We had met in a shopping center parking lot in Miami to complete the sale. I had no address for them. I called the police back and shared my suspicions. They took the seller's details, but warned me not to get my hopes up. Car theft rings often used fake IDs and burner phones. I spent the next few hours combing through my browser history, trying to find the original ad for the Ferrari. It had been deleted. I searched for similar ads, wondering if the seller was still active. Nothing. The police called back. The seller's ID was fake. They were adding it to their investigation, but advised me to start the insurance claim process. The reality sank in. I might never see my Ferrari again. I opened my laptop to begin the tedious insurance paperwork, my mind racing with unanswered questions about the seller and the fake cop. Were they working together? How long had they planned this? I pushed the thoughts aside. Right now, I needed to focus on the practical steps to move forward. As I began filling out the forms, a bitter realization hit me. I knew the price that I paid for the Ferrari was too good to be true. When I was 20, back in 1992, I was driving from Seattle to my college in San Francisco. I had just finished visiting my sister in Seattle and decided to make the long drive, half over that night. I was in my Honda Civic that I'd had since high school, reliable but not exactly a speed demon. Around 11 p.m., I found myself on a quiet stretch of I-5 in Northern California. The night was clear, but the road was dark and lonely. Everything seemed normal until I stopped at a 24-hour gas station just past Redding. As I pulled back onto the highway, a black SUV suddenly appeared behind me and started following. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after an hour, I realized it was still there. The SUV had tinted windows and a large dent in the front bumper. I could make out two figures in the front seats, a woman driving and a man in the passenger seat. As the SUV continued to follow me, my mind raced through various scenarios. Was this just some aggressive driver or something worse? I gripped the steering wheel tighter, acutely aware of how vulnerable I felt as a young woman alone on this dark stretch of highway. The longer this went on, the more my unease grew. I tried to shake off these thoughts and focus on the immediate problem. Right now, I just needed to figure out how to shake this SUV, regardless of who was driving it or why they were following me. I started to get nervous. The SUV would sometimes fall back, then suddenly appear right on my bumper, so close I couldn't see its headlights. I tried speeding up, but my little Civic could only go so fast. Even when I pushed it to 90 miles per hour, the SUV kept pace effortlessly. This cat-and-mouse game continued for many, many miles. Terrified, I scanned desperately for a police car but saw none. I didn't dare exit, afraid they would follow. The highway was eerily empty, and I felt completely alone. I had my Chihuahua, Frankie, in his carrier on the passenger seat, but he was more scared than I was. I realized my only advantage might be fuel efficiency. I prayed my Civic's full tank would outlast their gas-guzzling SUV. After what felt like an eternity, I noticed the SUV starting to fall behind. Eventually, it disappeared from my rearview mirror, maybe tired of the game or something else entirely. I drove on for another hour, shaking with relief and leftover adrenaline. To this day, I don't know what those people wanted, but the memory of that night still sends chills down my spine. Needless to say, I never drove through the night alone again. It was late, around 2 a.m., when I decided to stop at a remote gas station near Bozeman, Montana. I had been driving for hours, and my tank was running low. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. The place looked old and run down, but I didn't have much choice. I pulled up to the pump in my Audi A3, swiped my card at the pump, and started to fill the tank. The air was still, and the only sound was the hum of the gas pump. I glanced around, feeling a bit uneasy. There were no other cars, and the station seemed deserted. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. As I finished pumping the gas, the door to the small convenience store opened. Two men stepped out, both wearing jeans and dark jackets. They looked at me with cold, assessing eyes. They were closely followed by a woman in dark clothing. I tried to smile and nod, but they didn't respond. Instead, they walked over, stopping a few feet away from me. One of the men spoke, his voice low and gravelly, telling me we had a problem. I responded, trying to keep my voice steady, saying I was just getting gas. The taller man, more muscular, leaned against the pump, blocking my way back to the car. I had lost sight of the woman. I had no idea at that time if she was with them or not. The first man looked me up and down, then smirked. He commented that with a fancy car like mine, I must be a long way from home. A knot formed in my stomach. I told him I was just passing through, hoping to end the conversation quickly. The tall man chuckled, asking if I was lost. I insisted that I just needed to get back on the road. His eyes narrowed, noting that not many people like me come through at this time of night. Finally, the pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. I reached for the nozzle, but the first man stepped closer, blocking my path. His tone turned menacing as he said we had an issue. I frowned, confused, and asked him what he meant, trying to keep my voice steady. He smirked, glancing at his partner, and explained that I needed to hand over my wallet. Nice and easy. I hesitated, my heart racing. I glanced around, hoping to see another customer or any sign of help, but the station remained deserted. The tall man moved closer, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath. He noted my hesitation, his voice turning darker. He suggested that if I didn't want to hand over my wallet, maybe we could work something out. My pulse quickened. I told them I needed to get going, edging toward my car. But the first man grabbed my arm, his grip tight. He told me I wasn't going anywhere. Panic set in, and I yanked my arm free, adrenaline surging through me. I shouted at them to get out of my way. The tall man pulled out a knife. He told me, in a deadly serious voice, that I should listen to his friend. My heart raced. I glanced around, looking for a way out. The store was too far, and my car was blocked by them. I had to think fast. I told them okay, and to just take what they wanted, raising my hands in surrender. The first man smirked, reaching for my wallet. Before he could grab it, I yanked the gas nozzle out of the car and swung it, hitting him hard in the face. He stumbled back, cursing. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted toward my car, yanking the door open. The tall man lunged at me, but I slammed the door shut, locking it just in time. He pounded on the window, shouting obscenities. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to start. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I saw the two men running after me. After a few minutes of driving, I started to relax, thinking I had escaped. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Suddenly, a figure sat up in the back seat. It was a woman who had been lying flat and hidden beneath a dark blanket. It was the woman who followed the two men out of the small convenience store. She told me to keep driving. My blood ran cold as I realized the night's horrors weren't over yet. She said she was armed. She pulled out a gun to prove it. I nodded, trying to keep my breathing steady. The woman leaned forward. She told me to take the next exit. I complied, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. As we drove, my mind raced, trying to piece together how she'd gotten into my car. Then it hit me. She must have slipped in while I was distracted at the pump, fighting off those two men. She directed me onto a dirt road. The car bounced and shuddered as we made our way deeper into the woods. She ordered me to stop. I cut the engine, the sudden silence deafening. She got out, walking around to my door. I sat, frozen, as she opened it. She gestured for me to get out. I did, my legs shaky. She pointed to the woods with her gun, telling me to start walking. I hesitated. I raised my hands, fear coursing through me. I started walking, leaves crunching under my feet. After a few minutes, she told me to stop and turn around. I did, expecting the worst. She told me to toss her my phone, wallet, and car keys. I did. but she just stood there, gun lowered. She told me she was sorry, that they just wanted my possessions and didn't want to harm me. Then she turned and walked away. I stood there, stunned, until the sound of my car starting jolted me back to reality. I watched as my taillights faded into the distance. I was alone in the woods, miles from anywhere, with nothing. But I was alive. I walked along the dirt road for about 40 minutes. The night was still dark when I spotted a small farmhouse set back from the road. Exhausted, I stumbled up the driveway and knocked on the front door. After a pause, the door cracked open. A burly man with a thick beard peered out, shotgun in hand. I quickly explained my situation, hands raised. His expression softened, and he lowered the gun. He invited me inside and called the police. Within 30 minutes, a deputy arrived to take my statement. As I recounted the night's events, I felt the adrenaline finally wearing off. The fear and exhaustion hit me all at once. The deputy assured me they'd do everything they could to find the suspects and my stolen car. The farmer offered me his couch to rest. I gratefully accepted, knowing the ordeal was over, but that the memory would stay with me for a long time to come. I was driving home from a party at a friend's place late at night, and the roads were dead quiet. It was just past midnight, and the suburban streets were completely empty. The roads at that time of night were usually peaceful, and tonight seemed no different. As I got closer to the woodsy part of the road, only about 15 minutes from home, I saw headlights in the distance. Nothing about it seemed strange at first, but as they approached, the lights became blindingly bright. I tried to keep my eyes focused on the road, but it got harder the closer the car got. Then, just when I thought it would pass me, I realized the car wasn't in its lane. It was heading straight at me, driving on the wrong side of the road. Instinct took over, my tires screeching as I veered off and crashed into a ditch. For a second, I sat frozen, gathering myself and checking myself over. I shoved the door open and scrambled out of the car, my heart racing as I looked down the road. The car that nearly ran me off the road had stopped just ahead. The headlights were off now, and for a moment, I thought maybe they'd pulled over to help, but there was no movement, no sense of urgency from them. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of what just happened. My anger quickly took over as I climbed out of the ditch, brushing dirt off myself. How could they be so reckless? I was alive, but my car was totaled, and they'd almost killed me. I wasn't sure if they were drunk or just didn't care, but either way, I was furious. I started walking toward their car, demanding some sort of explanation. That's when I saw the driver get out. A guy, maybe in his 30s, looking confused, as if he didn't understand what he had just done. I was ready to let him have it, but before I could even say anything, he started yelling back at me, saying something about me driving on the wrong side of the road. My anger spiked, and I was ready to argue, but something about his voice threw me off. His accent. It wasn't American. That's when it clicked. He wasn't from here. He sounded British, and from the way he was shouting, it was clear he thought I was the one in the wrong. He must have been driving as if he were still in the UK, where they drive on the opposite side. For a second, I almost felt sorry for him, but my frustration was too strong. This guy had nearly killed me. He kept shouting at me. He thought he was in the right, as if I was the one breaking the rules. I tried to get a word in, to tell him he was on the wrong side of the road, but he wasn't having any of it. His passenger got out too, She was trying to calm him down, but it wasn't working. He was too worked up, insisting that I was the problem. Realizing the gravity of the mistake, I backed off for a moment and took a deep breath. I wasn't getting anywhere with him, and there was no way I was going to handle this on my own. I hurried back to my car and grabbed my phone. I called 911, giving them my location and explaining what had happened. They told me they'd send someone over right away. As I waited for the cops, I stood by my car, trying to keep my distance from the couple. They were still bickering, but it seemed like he was starting to piece together what had really happened. Then, they both fell silent. The realization must have sunk in. They hadn't been paying attention to the road signs. It was an honest mistake, but it was one that nearly cost me my life. The guy, finally understanding what he'd done, looked over at me, his anger melting into something more like embarrassment. After things calmed down, he walked over and explained they had just arrived in the country earlier that night, flying in from the UK. After the police arrived, they took both of our statements and quickly understood what had happened. With no injuries and no malicious intent, they treated it as a case of confusion due to unfamiliarity with local traffic rules. The tourists were still a bit shaken, but after talking for a while, it was clear they felt bad about the whole situation. We calmed down, had a polite conversation, and even exchanged contact details for the insurance report. By the time my car was being loaded onto the tow truck, things had settled, and they apologized once again. A few months later, I had a work trip to the UK, and the memory of that night crossed my mind. One simple mistake had almost escalated into something far worse. And I'll admit, when I was there, I didn't even dare to drive on their roads. The thought of driving on the left side of the road was enough to keep me from getting behind the wheel during my trip. When this harrowing experience took place, I had just turned 18 and was making a solo drive from Portland to Salem, Oregon. My boyfriend and I had planned to visit his mother, who lived on the outskirts of Salem, for a long weekend. He was coming from Eugene, where he attended college, so we agreed to meet at his mom's place. It was mid-autumn, so darkness fell early. I set out from Portland around 8:30 p.m., anticipating a 70-minute journey. By 9 o'clock, I was still about 30 to 40 minutes from my boyfriend's mom's house, and I was trying to maintain a sense of calm and confidence. It's not that I had any specific premonition, but being a young woman driving alone, I couldn't help but have some concerns lurking in the back of my mind. The usual I-5 route was blocked by a major accident, so my GPS redirected me down a series of back roads. As I turned onto a poorly lit country road, I felt eerily isolated. I didn't particularly enjoy the sensation of being completely alone out there, but I did my best to push those thoughts aside, reminding myself that I'd reach my destination before long. I had traveled the usual route many times before without incident, so I hoped the detour would be the same. How wrong I was. I was about 20 minutes from the house when I noticed some flashing lights in the distance. As I got closer, I could make out two blinking yellow lights in the middle of the road, which I quickly identified as hazard lights on a vehicle. An uneasy feeling began to creep over me, and I didn't like that the car wasn't pulled over to the shoulder, but instead was blocking the center of the road. I came to a stop about 60 feet away and started to contemplate my next move, One thing was certain. There was no way I was going to stop and offer assistance. I mean, I was barely 18, alone on a dark country road. It would be absolutely reckless to stop for anyone. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, still unsure of what to do. I had no cell service, so calling my boyfriend or his mom wasn't an option. I finally decided to turn around and head back until I got cell service to call my boyfriend and discuss the situation. I briefly considered whether or not I should also try to call for assistance for the folks ahead, but then realized they might have already done so. There was no way for me to know without approaching them, which I wasn't comfortable doing. I'm sure any other young woman in my situation would feel the same way. You have to prioritize your own safety over that of strangers. Always. The problem was that it was a narrow 2-lane road, and it would take more than a simple 3-point turn to reverse direction. As I hesitated, I glanced in my rearview mirror and noticed some shadows rapidly approaching my car from behind. I could barely make them out in the moonlight. As I sat there, still unsure what to do, the movement in my rearview mirror became clearer. They were moving quickly, heading straight for my car. Panic surged through me as I spotted something in their hands. Baseball bats. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. My body took over before my mind could catch up. I yanked the gear shift into drive and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. My little car lurched forward. I swerved around the stopped vehicle, my tires screeching as they hit the gravel on the shoulder. As I passed the other car, its doors suddenly flew open. More people spilled out, their faces hidden in the shadows. One of them reached out, trying to grab my side mirror. I jerked the wheel, narrowly avoiding their grasp. A loud thud echoed through the car as something hit my rear window. Cracks spiderwebbed across the glass, but it held together. I heard shouting behind me, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of my pounding heart. I kept my foot pressed firmly on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb higher and higher. The road ahead was dark and winding, but I didn't dare slow down. Every few seconds, I glanced in my rearview mirror, my heart racing. At times, I thought I could see pinpricks of light far in the distance behind me, but I couldn't be sure if they were headlights. The dark, winding road made it hard to tell for certain if I was being followed. I drove like that for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I could feel tears streaming down my face. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I just needed to get as far away from there as possible. I finally reached my boyfriend's mom's street, feeling utterly drained. My boyfriend's mom came out to meet me. She hugged me and quickly led me inside, asking if I was okay. Once we were in the house, she helped me settle down and gently encouraged me to explain what had happened. After taking a moment to collect myself, I began to tell her about the frightening experience I'd just been through. She kept asking if they had followed me there, and honestly, I had no idea. My boyfriend's mom is serious about security. She has multiple security cameras around her property. She checked the footage and noticed the same car passing by the front gate repeatedly, as if it was driving down the street, turning around and coming back multiple times. We decided it was time to call the police. The dispatcher said they would send officers to take our statement and patrol the area. However, given that the incident occurred outside their jurisdiction, they explained they'd also need to coordinate with the county sheriff's department. My boyfriend's mom was visibly frustrated by the jurisdictional complications. She asked what could be done immediately. The dispatcher advised us to stay inside, keep doors and windows locked, and call back if we saw any suspicious activity. They also said they'd alert neighboring law enforcement agencies about the incident, in case the suspects were still in the area. My boyfriend's mom thanked them, but emphasized her intention to protect her home and family if necessary. The dispatcher acknowledged this, and that was the end of the conversation. She armed herself and told me to wait inside the house. She called my boyfriend, who was still about 45 minutes away, and went outside to check the property. I watched the security cameras as my boyfriend's mom checked the property. Suddenly, a car slowly approached and came to a stop right at the edge of the driveway. Two people got out, apparently not noticing my boyfriend's mom, who was already walking towards them. They tried pushing the gate open, and because I couldn't hear what was happening, all I saw was my boyfriend's mom run up to them and fire a warning shot into the air. I could tell she was yelling something at them, but I couldn't make out what. They scrambled back into their car and sped off quickly. We weren't sure if they'd return, but I had a feeling that was the end of it. My boyfriend arrived about 45 minutes later and kept apologizing profusely for having me drive alone. But I assured him it wasn't his fault, and the outcome might have been the same, even if he had been with me. We were safe, and that's what mattered most. It was a late Sunday night in early November, and I was driving back to Ann Arbor after visiting my parents in Columbus, Ohio for the weekend. The 3-hour journey stretched out in front of me, the road empty and dark, with only the occasional semi-truck passing by. A light drizzle had started, and I was tired, eager to get back to my college apartment and collapse into bed. That's when I saw her standing by the side of the road, her thumb out, a hitchhiker. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about her seemed harmless. She looked to be in her early 20s, dressed in a University of Michigan hoodie and jeans, carrying a small backpack with a Wolverines logo. I slowed down and pulled over. As my Toyota Corolla came to a stop on the gravel shoulder, I asked her where she was heading. She leaned in through the window and replied that she was trying to get back to campus in Ann Arbor if it wasn't too much trouble. I unlocked the door and told her to hop in. She climbed in, thanking me, the scent of rain and cigarettes following her. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds being the engine, the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers, and the tires on the wet pavement. She seemed normal enough, making small talk about midterms and how quiet I-75 was at night. After a while, the conversation died down, and she seemed to get more comfortable. She asked if I had a cigarette, so I handed her one. She lit it with a battered Zippo lighter, taking a deep drag, and stared out the window at the passing farmlands. Then, out of nowhere, she commented on how not many people stopped for hitchhikers these days. Too many crazies out there. Her tone had shifted. I forced a laugh, agreeing, but it felt off. She kept glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, her fingers tapping nervously on her knee. I asked her, where exactly on campus she was heading, but she just waved her hand vaguely, saying she'd tell me when to stop. Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last. The highway was completely deserted, and my unease grew as she shifted in her seat, her movements becoming more erratic. Then, without warning, she lunged for the steering wheel. The car swerved wildly, tires screeching on the wet road as I fought to regain control. I managed to push her back into her seat, but she was strong, eyes wild and desperate. She hissed that I wasn't going anywhere and pulled out a switchblade from her hoodie pocket. My heart raced as the blade glinted in the dashboard's dim light. I slammed on the brakes, sending both of us jolting forward against our seatbelts. Before she could react, I unclipped my seatbelt and threw myself at her, wrestling for the knife. The struggle in the confined space was brutal. She slashed at me, and I felt the sharp pain of the blade grazing my forearm. I grabbed her wrist, slamming it against the door until the knife clattered to the floor mat. She was stronger than she looked, pinning me against the seat, her hands squeezing around my throat, cutting off my air. The smell of cigarettes on her breath was overwhelming. Desperately, I kicked out, my foot connecting with her knee. She screamed in pain, loosening her grip just enough for me to break free. I scrambled for the door handle, flinging it open and tumbling out onto the wet road. As I hit the ground, I clutched the car keys tightly in my fist. Her curses echoed as I hit the asphalt and rolled away from the car. I didn't look back. I just ran, my feet pounding against the pavement, my heart racing as I sprinted towards the tree line. The cold November rain soaked through my clothes, but I didn't stop. I could hear her behind me. Up ahead, I saw a narrow path leading into the woods. I darted off the road, hoping to lose her in the trees. The branches scratched at my face and arms, thorns tearing at my jeans. But I kept going. Her footsteps were getting closer. I spotted a fallen oak tree and scrambled over it, crouching behind the moss-covered trunk. I held my breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. As she drew closer, her shadowy figure moved through the trees, the knife still glinting in her hand. She stopped a few feet from where I was hiding, looking around. Her breathing was ragged, her face twisted with frustration, illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning. I prayed she wouldn't see me. After a few tense moments, she cursed under her breath and started back toward the road. I waited until I was sure she was gone before I stood up, my legs shaking. As I started back to the car, I heard a noise behind me. She had spotted me and was now in pursuit. I ran through the forest, no longer trying to be quiet. When I got to the road, I saw the Toyota Corolla still there, its door open. I ran up to the car, keys in hand. I could hear her getting closer. I got into the driver's seat and locked the doors just as she came out of the trees. My hands were shaking as I tried to start the car. The hitchhiker reached the car and tried to open the door. I managed to start the engine and drove away quickly. I saw her in the rearview mirror as I sped off. I drove until I reached the next small town. I pulled into a BP gas station, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. The night attendant looked concerned as I walked in, probably noticing the cuts, bruises, and mud on my arms and clothes. He asked if I was okay, and I nodded, barely able to speak. I asked to use the phone to call the police, explaining that I'd lost mine during the attack. As I sat there waiting, clutching a cup of bad vending machine coffee, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to losing my life. I had tried to do a good deed, and it almost cost me everything. When the police finally arrived, they took my statement and promised to look for the woman. I thanked them, but deep down, I knew it would be a long time before I felt safe driving alone again. I'd spent most of my career patrolling the quiet highways and back roads of the Great Plains. Out here, it's miles of open farmland and long stretches of sky with barely a soul in sight. Most nights were peaceful, maybe even boring. Just a wandering drunk or a stray animal crossing the road. But not this one. That night, I was out on a night shift, making my rounds through the rural roads. By midnight, the town's already asleep, and there's hardly any traffic. My job usually involves running speed checks, making sure no one's trespassing on farmland, and occasionally checking on a parked vehicle. It's routine work, but tonight, as I drove down the empty road with fields and trees on either side, something was different. Out of nowhere, a loud sound pierced through the stillness. I slowed right down and tried to place it, but I couldn't figure out where it was coming from or even what it was. The sound was unsettling, to say the least. I pulled over and sat for a second to listen. It came again, this time more like a voice. But I couldn't tell if it was a man, woman, or even a child, or what they were saying. I tried to call it in, but the radio was dead, just static. I turned on the siren lights and got out of the cruiser, flashlight in hand and gun holstered at my side. I shined my light toward the trees, but saw nothing. The sound was coming from somewhere within the woods. "Who's out there?" I yelled, stepping toward the tree line. A woman's scream pierced the air. She sounded panicked. I froze for a moment, then called out again, asking who it was and if she was okay. The next response, it sounded like an elderly person, weaker, but still desperate. I grabbed my handheld radio, trying to call for backup again, but it was also dead. I took a few steps closer. I called out once more, but the scream had changed. It no longer sounded like a woman or an elderly person. It sounded deeper now, maybe a man. I hesitated but took a few more steps forward. The next time I called out, it shifted again. This time, it was higher pitched, like a child. I pushed deeper into the woods. I was at least 50 paces into the woods now, but the screams weren't getting any closer. No matter how far I walked, they stayed just out of reach. The voices, though, continued to shift. The frantic cry of a woman became the plea of an elderly person, then a man's deep shout, followed by the shrill wail of a child. Each time it changed. The distance never did. I stopped in my tracks. This wasn't right. Every instinct I had told me to turn back, that I was walking into something that I couldn't explain. So I did. I turned right around and headed back towards the cruiser. But even as I did, I could still hear the screams trailing me, never getting closer, never getting further, just remaining the same distance. Finally, I made it back to the cruiser. The siren lights were still flashing, and the headlights were still shining down the dark, empty road. I felt a wave of relief just to be back in the safety of the car. I tried again to call it in once more, but the radio was still static. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I hadn't been sleeping well prior, not since I'd started back on the night shift. The late hours had been getting to me, but it was more than that. I'd only just returned from bereavement leave after losing my wife to cancer a few months before. She was my high school sweetheart, my best friend. The grief had been screwing with me, making me question my own thoughts, the meaning of my life, and sometimes even my will to keep going. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just in my head. I still patrol the same roads, and I've never experienced anything like it again. Thankfully.